So hello there, this is a brief overview of Steam for Linux Beta. Just a few words on the settings. This is a virtual machine running ElementaryOS Beta. So I'm going to apologise ahead of time for any frame rate slowdowns or anything like that, especially as the recording software I'm using is the open source FF Split, which is very good for something that's free, but I think has a few bugs versus XSplit. The operating system I'm using at the minute is ElementaryOS. It's based on Ubuntu, but it's using the Pantheon interface, which is stressing as much as possible the GTK3 toolkit. And it's rather nice, it's quite attractive, but I think the developers would be the first to say that there's a few things to iron out. And talking of beta, let's look at Steam, which on interface levels looks fantastic. It looks just like the Windows version of Steam. I can't speak for Mac, I don't have an Intel based Mac, but I'm assuming that looks very much similar. Now, the first thing I noticed was this little bit here where it's highlighting Linux games, and that's probably one of the first downsides to look at as well, because out of a library of around 200 games, which we can see here, you've got all of 18 games that are able to run in Linux. Now, if Linux is your only platform, that can actually be a bigger problem still, because when you look at the store, it's not immediately obvious whether the game will run under Linux or not. When you look at the system requirements, it tells you OS, Windows Vista, Windows 7. If it happens to be able to run on Apple Mac, it will tell you that as well. But if we look at, say, frozen synapse in this search here, now you can see here you've got the Windows, Apple and Linux icon, and that is going to be the only way you'll know if this runs on Linux if you don't know already. When you scroll down and you look at the system requirements, it gives you Mac system requirements, it gives you PC system requirements. It's not giving you Linux system requirements in the description, or adding Linux as a supported operating system in PC system requirements. That's with a game that you do know runs on Linux. If you don't know, you don't know. There's not much to actually let you know. So you don't feel safe buying a game if Linux is your only operating system. But this is beta. I have no doubt that Valve are working on things like that. What I do like, however, is if you already have a library of games, you don't have to rebuy them just because you're moving over to Linux. If it's supported, it will be there in your list of games. And this is really good news as far as I'm concerned, because it means that you've got more choice in terms of the operating system that you're going to use. If Valve can really push this and can get developers to either port the games to Linux or start developing for Linux in the first place, which a lot of indie developers are doing right now, which is good news, then we're getting a lot more option in terms of what we can use as an operating system. Certainly for the geeks amongst us. I mean, I'm not exactly been a big fan of Windows 8 thus far, certainly not its interface, which I think breaks every CLI convention there is. Windows 7 is good enough for now, but I'd like to be able to run Linux sometimes, and there are computers that I like running Linux. On the netbook, for example, this is going to be great. I can go into Steam and run games that are compatible with Linux. Brilliant. Very happy about that. So the other thing to talk about is performance. Now, again, we've got to hark back to the fact that I'm running this on a virtual machine and I'm capturing the video at the same time. So you may see a few slowdowns, a few audio distortions, but when the games that are running on Linux do run on, say, bare metal, or even just in the virtual machine when I'm not recording, I've got to say that the performance has been absolutely exemplary. When Valve started porting Team Fortress to Linux, for example, they actually reported a number of performance improvements, which does bode well for the platform as a whole, especially if you want to develop a console type application, which is exactly what they're doing right now. Excuse my poor gameplay here. This is fantastic. Again, we're talking about platform choice. Are we stuck running Windows? With the Steam is such a big player in terms of the games market that getting your game on Steam, if you decide to run it on Linux as well as on Windows as well as on OS X, people have a choice. Probably the most important factor is if you're bringing someone to Linux that isn't used to it. There's been a lot of usability gains with Linux in the past few years. For example, installing applications. When I tried installing applications 10 years ago, it was a nightmare. As a Linux newbie, I had no idea what to do. Now, I'm a lot more comfortable with the command line, but things like the software center that you have here, where you can go, I want graphics software, drawing, right, let's try this, let's see if this vector graphics editor is of any good. Click and install, type in your password, and away you go, and it's there. That's appealing. The installation process, where you actually load into the operating system, install it from within the operating system, and then reboot, and there it is, all sorted for you. This is really good. They've made a lot of usability strides. And apart from those moments where you suddenly find yourself having to drop back out into the command line, hence the terminal is there in my dock, because I want it accessible all the time. Apart from those moments, Linux can actually be one of the most user-friendly operating systems out there if you don't need to do too much. Adding Steam into that adds to that usability. If you know what you're doing, then Steam allows you to tweak things to how you want them to be tweaked. If you're not quite so comfortable, then it makes an easily accessible gaming platform for people. And especially as we get onto this big picture mode, having it hooked up to your TV, I love this idea. Being able to have Linux there with controller support, and I must admit, things like the Xbox 360 controller, it just plugs and plays, although I have heard of configuration issues to do with the controller with Steam for Linux, so that's something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of in big picture mode is, again, this same issue of all of your games in your library are going to show up straight off until you click on view all games, and then your rather more paltry Linux selection will show up. I think that should be by default. Well, I think it really does need to show itself. It needs to highlight what will run under Linux and what won't, and it needs to make that far more explicit, because until it does, I can see there being problems for people in the future, especially if they launch this Steam box. So there you go, it's just a brief overview, nothing very special, but I like what I see so far. The performance is good, the usability is good. Thank you very much for watching.